I'm going to do a reading from Seed to Civilization, The Story of Man's Food by Charles B. Heiser, Jr., published in 1973. This is from Chapter 5 on grasses, and this section is on wheat. The most widely cultivated plant in the world today, wheat, as was pointed out in an earlier chapter, was one of man's first two cultivated plants. The other, barley, has continued to the present day to be of importance, but chiefly as animal feed and as the source of malt for making beer. Wheat has become man's principal cereal, being more widely used for the making of bread than any other cereal because of the quality and quantity of its gluten. As it is gluten that makes bread dough stick together and gives it the ability to retain gas, the higher the proportion of gluten in the flour, the better for making bread. Bread, of course, was not one of man's first prepared foods, for the primitive wheats first used by man were hardly suited for making bread. It seems likely that wild wheat and the early cultivated wheats were prepared by parching, which would have the advantage of removing the chafy bracts surrounding the grain, as well as making it more readily digestible. By grinding the parched grain and adding water, a gruel could be made. A beer of sorts may have been another early product in which grain was used. For a beer to be made, it would be necessary for some of the starch. Footnote: starch is hydrolyzed to a fermentable sugar by the action of certain enzymes. Such enzymes for making beer could have been supplied by certain molds, by a malt, that is, by germinating seeds, or by mastication. Malting barley is known to be quite ancient, being recorded on early written documents. Of the grain to be converted into sugar, which then could be fermented by wild yeasts. Man found such a brew to his liking, and although he may not have known it, it was a nutritious drink. Yeast, in fact, may have become a cultivated plant before the grains were, for residues from beer originally made from wild ingredients, including yeast, might have been used for starting new batches, meaning that the yeast was actually being cultivated. Sometime later, leavened bread resulted from the same process. The carbon dioxide bubbles formed during the fermentation process, becoming trapped in the sticky dough and causing it to rise. Unleavened bread, of course, was probably used earlier and continues to have significance in certain religious ceremonies. Wild wheats, which still are found in the Near East in some abundance, were being collected by man long before domestication occurred. Flint blades, which were apparently used for sickles to harvest grain, have been found in archaeological deposits dating back some 12,000 years. Milling stones and querns for grinding were even older, although we do not necessarily know that they were used for cereals. Evidence that the wild cereals could have supplied man with an abundance of food was provided by Jack Harlan, an American botanist, a few years ago. With a flint sickle, he was able to harvest 4 pounds of grain in an hour. Thus, as he points out, primitive man could have, in a space of a few weeks, harvested more than enough grain to feed a family for a year. We may never know for certain why the grain became cultivated, but we do now have considerable information about how the wild plant became transformed into man's most important domesticated plant. We shall see that the process involved a number of accidental or natural hybridizations, followed by a doubling of chromosomes in the prehistoric period. The working out of the details of the origin of the domesticated wheats is as fascinating as any detective story, at least to the botanist, and the understanding of the origin of the plants has furnished knowledge of great importance to the plant breeder in his efforts to improve them. Our present understanding of these origins is not the work of one or a few people, but results from a great many botanical studies conducted during this century in Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, England, and Israel. Taxonomists, of course, had described many different species of wheat during the previous 150 years, and Linnaeus had provided the genus name, choosing Triticum, an old Latin name for cereal. In the early part of this century, taxonomists recognized on the basis of the appearance of the plants that there were 3 groups of species of wheat. Shortly after, it was shown that the 3 different groups were characterized by different chromosome numbers, the diploids having 14 chromosomes, the tetraploids having 28, and the hexaploids 42. Thus, the wheat species formed a polyploid series with a base chromosome number of 7. Footnote: the eggs and sperms of an organism each contain 1 set of chromosomes and are called haploid. The union of sperm and egg as a result of fertilization gives rise to a plant or animal designated as diploid that has 2 sets of chromosomes, 1 derived from each parent. Most plants and animals are diploid, but particularly in plants, we may find individuals or species characterized by having more than 2 sets of chromosomes, and they are known as polyploids. Polyploidy results from a quote-unquote accident in the chromosome division in a species, or more frequently, in a hybrid between species. In the wheats, there are 2 sorts of polyploids: tetraploids having 4 sets of chromosomes and hexaploids having 6. Chromosomes of a plant are studied by observation of dividing cells, usually anthers in which young pollen grains are developing or young roots are used. The structures are crushed and treated with a stain that makes the chromosomes visible, and then examined under a compound microscope at high magnification. The species with 14 chromosomes include the wild acorn, Triticum bioticum, which still grows wild in the Near East, and the cultivated einkorn, Triticum monococcum, which differs little from its wild counterpart except in having slightly larger grains and less brittle rachises of the fruit stalks that prevent the grains from falling quite so readily. Einkorn is a low-yielding species, but is cultivated to a limited extent in the Near East and in Central and Southeastern Europe. The chromosome sets of the diploid wheat eventually came to be designated A, which will just be called AA. The 28 chromosome wheats comprise several species. One of these, Triticum dicoccoides, or wild emmer, is a wild species. The cultivated emmer, Triticum dicoccum, is grown principally in Asia and the Mediterranean area. Formerly used for making bread and pastries, it is now used mainly for livestock feed. Both of the emmers have covered or hulled grains, a characteristic of wild grasses. Several of the tetraploid wheats have naked grains that thresh free, a boon to man, of course, but detrimental for a wild species. Among the species with naked grains, we find durum, or macaroni wheat, Triticum durum, which is one of the important wheats today. The chromosome composition of the tetraploids is designated AABB, with each letter representing a set of chromosomes. Several species with 42 chromosomes are also known, including some with hulled grains, such as spelt, Triticum spelta, once the principal wheat of Europe, and some with naked grains, such as bread or common wheat, Triticum aestivum, which has become the type most widely grown throughout the world today and preferred for bread. The hexaploids are designated AABBDD. In a polyploid series, the most ancient species is the one with the lowest chromosome number, and from this it would follow that einkorn, AA, is the starting point for the derivation of the other wheats. Einkorn hybridized with another species with chromosome sets BB, and following chromosome doubling, gave rise to the tetraploid or AABB species. One of these tetraploids, in turn, hybridized with still another species with the DD chromosome constitution, and this triploid hybrid, in turn, doubled its chromosomes to give rise to the hexaploid, or AABBDD wheats. Through a series of brilliant investigations, the other species involved in the origin of the tetraploids and hexaploids have been fairly certainly identified. Both are species of the genus Aegilops, or goat grass. Footnote: some people now place the goat grasses in the same genus as wheat, Triticum, instead of in Aegilops. A weedy grass worthless to man except for its contribution of chromosomes to wheat. The contributor of the BB chromosomes is probably Aegilops speltoides, which is found in southeastern Turkey across the Fertile Crescent, or a species similar to it. The DD chromosomes, which contributed genes for the high gluten content of the hexaploids, as well as making them better adapted to extreme environments than are the other wheats, come from Aegilops squarrosa, a species that ranges from eastern Turkey to Kashmir and Pakistan. Man apparently had no role in the development of the polyploid wheats, except perhaps for unwittingly bringing the cultivated plants and weeds together so that it was possible for hybridization to occur. In addition to the accidental hybridizations and chromosome doublings that gave rise to the tetraploid and hexaploid wheats, one other event was of paramount importance in their evolution. This was a mutation that influenced the chromosome pairing in the polyploid plants so that they had good fertility. Ralph Riley, who with V. Chapman is responsible for our knowledge of it, has called attention to the importance of this single mutation for the development of the whole of Western civilization. Archaeological work has helped to supply approximate dates as well as to indicate the general areas where the wheat species developed. Wild emmer has been reported from the archaeological site of Tel Muribat on the banks of the Euphrates, dated at about 8000 BC. Wild einkorn, and emmer are all found at Ali Kash in southwestern Iran in deposits dated between 7,500 to 6,750 BC, and both wild einkorn and emmer occur at Hausalar, dated at about 7,000 BC in west central Anatolia. At Jarmo in the Iraqi Kurdistan in deposits dated at about 6750 BC, both wild and cultivated einkorn have been found along with grains that appear to be somewhat transitional between wild and cultivated emmer. Deposits in Greece dated back to 6100 BC reveal both einkorn and emmer. From these finds, it appears that man may still have been collecting wild wheats at the same time cultivation was beginning, which is hardly surprising since the early cultivated plants were probably neither high-yielding nor extensively grown. Both einkorn and emmer appear to have come into cultivation at about the same time, with emmer being the more widely cultivated. Bread wheat, as might be expected, came somewhat later. There is archaeological evidence for its presence at Katal Hayak in Anatolia in the period 5850 to 5600 BC, and at Tepe Sabz in southwestern Iran between 5500 and 5000 BC, and at Hausalar between 5800 and 5000 BC. A tentative identification would place the species in Greece at about 6000 BC. The times of the appearance of various wheat species will probably have to be revised somewhat as future archaeological works take place. Although the earliest cultivation was apparently confined to the Near East, the wheats were soon to become widespread. Emmer was to become the principal wheat of ancient Egypt. Footnote: occasionally an item is published in the newspaper to the effect that Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so on a vacation to Egypt visited the pyramids and brought home with them a few grains of quote-unquote mummy wheat, several thousand years old, and that the grains were planted and gave rise to healthy wheat plants. While it is true, of course, that grains of wheat dating back to pre-Christian times have been found in Egypt, there is no scientific verification of their ever germinating. Wheat seeds, as is true of most plants, have a rather short life, lasting only a few years. From early cultivation in the Balkans, wheat spread to other parts of Europe. One of the hexaploids, spelt, may have originated in Central Europe, where it was prominent in prehistoric and early historical times. Other hexaploid wheats appeared in India, probably before the 4th millennium BC, and in China sometime before the beginning of the Christian era. Some people think mainly of rice in connection with both of these countries, but wheat early became an important plant there and continues to be one in the more temperate parts of the countries. The Spanish brought wheat to the Americas, and eventually the United States, Canada, and Argentina were to become among the world's greatest producers. Parenthesis, as token of the way technological and scientific development is drastically altering agricultural practice, it is interesting that the United States, where wheat is a relatively new crop, recently sent agricultural specialists to Turkey to give advice on growing wheat, where the crop has been grown for thousands of years. Wheat grows best in cool climates, with little to moderate amounts of rain, and many areas of the Earth's surface are suitable for its cultivation. Wheat is being harvested somewhere in the world every month of the year. Of the several species brought into domestication, only two are of major importance today. Triticum aestivum, used primarily for flour, for bread and pastries, and Triticum durum, principally employed for making paste products such as macaroni, spaghetti, and noodles. Both species are cultivated in the United States, the latter principally in North Dakota. In the northern part of the United States and in Canada, wheat is planted in the spring. To the south of this area, it is sown in the fall. Although in some parts of the world the methods employed in growing, harvesting, and utilizing wheat are only little changed from those used in prehistoric times, in other parts there have been great advances in wheat farming and processing the grain, from the introduction of modern mechanical planting and harvesting to steam-driven rollers for milling. In the first part of this century, it still took tremendous manpower to thresh and harvest wheat, although some machinery was used. The combines used today consolidate what were formerly many separate operations of threshing and harvesting and can be operated by a single person. The combine has thus led to drastic changes in farm life, including the virtual disappearance of the old threshing quote-unquote party. 40 years ago, straw stacks were a common sight on farms in the Midwestern United States. Now the straw is usually scattered on the fields in the combining process or neatly baled. The straw, although of minor importance compared to the grain, has some uses. Not a nutritious hay for livestock, wheat straw is unusually strong and has many uses on a farm that can be used also by manufacturers as a filling for mattresses and in the making of paper and paper board. Man's bread, too, has changed. To make a white flour, it is necessary to remove the germ and the bran from the grain. Technological advances in the milling process over the years have led to a whiter flour. Since the natural product is somewhat yellowish in color, a bleach is sometimes employed, and chemicals such as sodium propionate are sometimes added during the baking process to retard spoilage of the bread. Although white flours have superior keeping and baking qualities, they are obviously much less nutritious than the whole wheat. Therefore, the flour is often enriched by the addition of vitamins and minerals, which is required by law in some countries. These, however, fail to compensate for all the nutrients that have been removed from the grain. In the past, a white bread was associated with the quote-unquote higher classes, or at least those with money. Recently, there has been a trend toward other kinds of bread, at least among some of the better educated. It is a sad note on modern civilization that man must remove some of the nutrients and then supply additives to the product that goes on the table. There have been changes in the wheat plant itself, as well as in the methods of growing, harvesting, and milling it. The evolution began, of course, at the time man began cultivating the wild grasses. As the wild plant had a brittle fruiting stalk, the grains tended to fall individually as they matured, an advantage for seed dispersal in nature, but undesirable for man, who wanted to collect all the grains at one time. With domestication, the fruiting stalk became less brittle, permitting the grains to remain on the plant. The cultivated plants develop seeds that would germinate evenly and rapidly, in contrast to the slower and irregular germination of those of the wild plant. The bracts surrounding the grain became more loosely attached, letting the grains fall free during the harvest, which made it easier to prepare them for eating. There was also some increase in the size of the grain. Numerous varieties of the different species came into existence through the agencies of mutation, hybridization, and both conscious and unconscious selection. Possibilities for hybridization increased as man moved from place to place or exchanged seeds with other people. As new varieties of wheat came into existence, some of the older ones tend to disappear, but many exist little changed for hundreds of years. In this century, plant breeders, through conscious selection and artificial hybridizations, have produced so many new varieties that today there are probably more than 1,000 different kinds of bread wheat alone, some of them tailor-made for high productivity. Special milling properties, adaptation to different climatic conditions, and resistance to disease. Perhaps it is resistance to disease that has occupied as much of the plant breeder's attention as any other character. Practically all of man's cultivated plants are subject to a number of diseases, and the wheat plant is particularly susceptible to stem rust caused by a fungus that belongs to the same group as the common mushroom, but is profoundly different in appearance. A severe infestation of stem rust can almost completely destroy a crop. Many races of wheat have been bred that are resistant to rusts, but the great difficulty is that there are also numerous races of rusts, and new, more virulent ones continually come into existence through mutation and hybridization. Thus, there will probably always be a need for the plant breeder to attempt to develop new resistant strains of wheat. Another accomplishment of the plant breeder has been his contribution to the doubling of the wheat yield in the United States in the course of a little more than a quarter of a century. Greater use of fertilizers and improved cultural practices have also contributed to the increased yields. Among the recent achievements of the wheat plant breeder and other agricultural scientists is the remarkable work accomplished in Mexico that has contributed significantly to the Green Revolution. In 1943, the Rockefeller Foundation, at the invitation of the Mexican government, went to that country to see what could be done to increase food production. Although maize is the basic food plant of Mexico, wheat is very important also, and Mexico was then importing half of the wheat it consumed. Much of the wheat being grown in Mexico at the time had changed little from that originally introduced by the Spanish in the early part of the 16th century. Working with Mexican agronomists, the scientists from the Rockefeller Foundation were able to double the yields in 20 years. By 1956, Mexico was self-sufficient in wheat, and since that time has produced some for export. A large part of the success resulted from the development through hybridization of rust-resistant varieties and dwarf forms able to take heavy applications of fertilizer without falling over. The older, taller varieties tended to lodge or fall over when given sufficient fertilizer to increase the yields and thus could not be readily harvested. The parental type of the new dwarf forms that have proved to be so successful originally came from the Orient. The first crop planted by Norman E. Borlaug, who headed the work for the Rockefeller Foundation, and in 1970 received the Nobel Prize for his contributions to agriculture, was lost to rust. Fortunately, a few of the original seeds were still left in the seed envelopes, and these were grown the next year and used for the crosses that ultimately gave the kinds of plants that were wanted. Some of the varieties developed for Mexico have proved to be successful in Pakistan and India, and Pakistan is now producing enough wheat for its own needs, while India is approaching that goal. It is reported that in parts of India that used to give 7 to 8 bushels an acre, yields of up to 60 to 70 bushels an acre are being secured by growing the new varieties under irrigation. In India, the new high-yielding varieties were attracting such attention that armed guards had to be posted at the experimental stations to prevent people from stealing seed before it was ready to be released to the public. Since wheat is a self-pollinating crop, once a hybrid has been stabilized and released to a farmer, he can simply multiply his own seed stock for future planting. Some years ago, the Russians made great claims for a perennial wheat that could be grown from year to year without replanting. Through hybridization of a wheat with a perennial grass, such a plant was actually made, but thus far it has been of little significance. Of potentially greater significance, perhaps, is a man-made hybrid between wheat and rye, first produced in Sweden. Although originally almost sterile, fertility has been built up through selection. The hybrid, called triticale, from triticum, wheat, and cicale, rye, gives grain that contains more and better protein than wheat, but as it is low in gluten, it cannot be used for making bread. Research is continuing in some places, particularly in Canada, on this quote-unquote man-made cereal plant. One of the next great breakthroughs in wheat breeding may come with the production of a hybrid wheat that cashes in on the phenomenon of hybrid vigor, the increased yield of first-generation hybrids, as does hybrid maize, which is discussed later in this chapter. Hybridization, both natural and man-made, has been of importance in the development of the wheats, but is far more difficult than in maize, owing to the differences in their flowers. Although both are grasses, wheat has bisexual flowers, whereas the sexes are separate in corn plants, making the production of hybrids a relatively simple matter. Although it is always important to produce a plant that can yield more per acre, production of wheat was so great in the United States in the early 1960s that it included what had been referred to as a quote-unquote embarrassing surplus, more than could be utilized at home or sold for export. It has been easier to breed high-yielding wheats than it has been to solve the problems of their distribution.